this is Tony Farrell and I've with me Chris Coverdale, and we met Chris 2 weeks ago in the House of Commons in front of Austin Mitchell and MP John Hemmings, didn't we?
Indeed.
And we met yesterday for the first time in terms of having a discussion together, and the main thrust of that discussion was the illegality of laws and the potential and the compulsion really to withhold all taxes in protest. So we had an interesting discussion. So I just wanted to explore that issue, because you campaigned against this for many years, haven't you?
Yes, basically, just to summarise where we've been at, I found out in 2002 that there was this thing called the International Criminal Court Act. And I started to look at it in detail, and by about August, September 2002, I realised that what was happening in Afghanistan and what was threatened to happen in Iraq would be totally unlawful, in breach of sections 51 and 52 of the International Criminal Court Act. And I thought, well, it's only just been passed. Tony Blair introduced the legislation, and it came into effect on the 1st of September 2001. And I was surprised that these were very serious criminal offences introduced into English law, into the law of England and Wales. The crimes were crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and conduct ancillary to these crimes. And I thought, well, this is the law of England and Wales. Why isn't anyone upholding it? So I started to investigate that and started to take action. I wrote to the Metropolitan Police, I wrote to the Commissioner, Lord Stevens at the time, and so on, and started to take action to try and get someone to uphold what I see to be the most important law that we've ever passed. And I've got absolutely nowhere. In the last 10 years, more than 10 years now.
Just blanket ignored you?
Yes, I mean, basically it has always been, we've had more than 300 approaches to the police in the last 10 years to raise the issue of, we have evidence that our government is breaking the criminal law, committing crimes under the laws of war, and we must uphold them and enforce them. And that's the job of the police, the Crown Prosecution Service and the judiciary, is to uphold the law. Now, of those 300 and something attempts, 5 of them have got as far as the Crown Prosecution Service. And what happens is that the police, there's a unit called the War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Unit at Scotland Yard. And when the police get a complaint of a war crime, it has to go to that unit to investigate it. Now that unit did its best not to investigate various things, but was forced to because of a useful incident that happened at Marylebone Police Station. However, as a result of their investigation, we had about 15 hours of giving evidence, all the evidence we have collected, that crimes of genocide have taken place in Afghanistan, Iraq, and since then in Libya. Crimes against humanity, war crimes, and conduct ancillary to those. It took about 15 hours to go through the evidence, and when the first hour or so, they were pretty dismissive. And you could see, oh, this is just another peace activist following his nose, if you like. But after they had considered the evidence that we put forward, they started to realise, well, there is something in this. There is this law, and it is quite obvious that it has been broken. So they put over all the information to the Crown Prosecution Service, and they spent about a month looking through it. They kept giving me feedback, well, they've still got it. Then I discovered that the first woman who had been in the Crown Prosecution Service responsible for the thing had been moved on, and had been passed on to another prosecutor.
Yeah.
And finally, we got a letter after about 4 months saying, no, we're not going to proceed with proceedings against Blair, Straw, Hoon, and all the rest of them, on the grounds that you have not provided evidence of intent to commit genocide, or evidence of intent to engage in crimes against humanity, or evidence of intent to commit war crimes. Now, I find this very strange because we have provided masses of evidence of intent, and so they'd obviously just ignored it or lost it or something. And secondly, it is not up to us to provide the information, it's up to the police to investigate this. We are the members of the public reporting the crimes. And the police had certainly got a lot of evidence from us, which has somehow got lost. And finally, this issue of refusing to initiate proceedings on the grounds of the mens rea, the intent. Intent has to be decided in court. It's up to the jury to decide whether someone, if someone's charged with murder and they're pleading manslaughter, for instance, the jury has to decide, did this person deliberately kill the victim? And exactly the same applies for genocide. Did Tony Blair and Jack Straw deliberately and willfully intend to destroy members of the Afghan and Iraqi national groups? And that was really the question that needed to be put to a jury in a case.
And if you had to summarise why you believe that to be the case, that they did deliberately commit genocide in their instructions for us to go to war, what would be the main arguments they would use?
You have to go back to the legislation. So that genocide, there are 4 elements of the crime of genocide by killing. In the legislation, the statutory instrument specifies those 4 items. The first one is that members of a national, ethnic, racial or religious group have been killed. The perpetrator has killed them. They are members of a national, ethnic, racial or religious group is the second one. The third one is to do with the intention. It was intentionally done. And fourthly is to do it as part of a widespread strategy or policy, basically. Now, if all of those 4 elements are in place, then a court has to convict somebody of genocide. And so what we were saying was all the others are in place. We know that they have fired cruise missiles into Kabul or Baghdad. And in doing so, knowing that a cruise missile will land, explode and kill anybody in the vicinity, you do not do that unintentionally. It's not an accidental death, it is an intentional death. If you didn't want to intend to kill somebody, you hand leaflets to them or you negotiate with them or something. You don't fire cruise missiles at them. And so there was a lot of evidence of intent to commit genocide. And it's actually, a lot of people misunderstand the crime of genocide, but it is laid out very clearly in the legislation, and that's the important bit in a sense. If we're going to charge somebody with genocide, we must go by the criteria that are laid down, elements of the crime laid down in the legislation.
And in the closing of ranks in the judiciary and in the police service, when you confronted him with this evidence and the legal arguments, why do you think, can you speculate on why you've had such a response?
I think there's sort of 3 different reasons. The first reason is that for 50 years at least, we have been, the whole public in Britain, the armed forces, Parliament, the media, the judiciary, the law enforcement authorities and so on, have been misinformed about the laws of war. We have been told that it's lawful if it's authorised by the UN Security Council. Now that is absolute rubbish. I've now studied the laws of war for the last 10 years, and it is absolutely clear to me that it is, in law, war was outlawed in 1928. It was confirmed to be illegal when the UN Charter was place in 1945 and confirmed by the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal in 1946, when they convicted Germany's leaders of invading and occupying 11 nation states. They did so on the grounds that they had breached the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and that's the treaty signed in 1928 by all the major nations, which says we renounce war as a political tool, and we will settle all disputes peacefully. And the Germany's leaders were actually prosecuted and convicted on the grounds that they had breached that 11 times during the Second World War. Now that's precisely the same crime that Bush and Blair and others committed. Now I think it's that background of not understanding the laws of war and believing the government when they say, there are terrorists out there, we've got to go and deal with them. Nobody understands that you cannot deliberately go out and kill a person. That has been unlawful since 1948, totally unlawful. Any person. And it's in that background of not understanding the law and constantly being told the wrong law by the government and by the Attorney General and others, most people go along with it.
We mentioned yesterday the potential of targeting the newly elected police commissioners,
yes,
who can hold chief constables to account.
I think it's a very good idea.
Yeah. What I want to do, though, is turn our attention to the public and the public's attitude, because there was some momentum in Stop the War campaign in 2004, 2005, and there were marches on the streets. But all that seems to have evaporated,
yes,
and there really isn't any great vocal calling to stop our aggressive foreign policies in the Middle East and the wars that we're involved in. And that obviously disappoints you and I. But have you got an explanation why you think that's the case, why the public interest has actually dwindled?
Again, I think this is, yes, I do have, my feelings are, I have been involved with the Stop the War Coalition, and what they achieved in February 2003, getting 1 million people out on the streets of London, was a fantastic achievement. But there were so many people then really keen to stop what was going on. But they have focused entirely on marching, demonstrating and protesting. And it's rather like a group of people standing at a railway crossing, shouting at the train to stop. You just know it has absolutely no effect whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do it over and over and over again, never having any effect at all, everybody's just going, oh well, it's a waste of time, this. And that's really why we have to take a different approach. We must start to go down the legal route,
mm-hmm,
the financial route, the political route, rather than marching, demonstrating and protesting, which has no effect on government policy.
That's right. I know, I've made a stance with my own council tax under Section 15 Article 3 of the Terrorism Act when I got booted out of South Yorkshire Police for speaking truth to power over the terror threat. So I've been in front of Barnsley Metropolitan Borough Council on that legal argument, refusing to pay council tax because of a portion of which would go to South Yorkshire Police, who were involved in the concealment of the London bombings. But I also argued that it was morally wrong and we went to war on a lie, on the basis of lies. But you thought the legislation that you would encourage the public who are morally outraged by the wars to actually embrace, and this would involve withholding council tax in some form or other. Can you elaborate what you've got in mind for that?
Yes, I think that the very important point is, it goes back to this International Criminal Court Act and the second half of it. The first 3 crimes are to do with the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes. And the second 3 are conduct ancillary to genocide, conduct ancillary to crimes against humanity and conduct ancillary to war crimes. And the legislation makes it quite clear. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court says if you are aiding and abetting this crime, you are guilty of an offence. including providing the means for the commission of the crime. Now that's very clear, and they have added it to the legislation. And what it means is that if you hand over money which is used for an unlawful purpose and is used to actually commit genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, you, because you are funding the crime, are guilty of a criminal offence. Now that came into law in England and Wales on the 1st of September 2001. Mm-hmm. On October the 7th 2001, Tony Blair started the war, or took Britain to war with Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So in law, technically, everyone who has paid tax of any sort whatsoever since 2001 has committed a criminal offence of conduct ancillary to genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes. Now this has been, they've been unwittingly done so.
That's right.
We haven't deliberately done it, but it's very important to get that piece of information out. And because the government never ever explains the laws of war to the public, we need to get that information out, and that's why they have never taken it up. But the crucial part of it is, you must, now that you know that it is a criminal offence to hand over tax, you must stop handing over the tax. And there is a part of the legislation which says that, okay, because it's been unwitting so far, mm-hmm. You will not be charged with an offence if you abandon the attempt to commit the crime. So legislators are saying, look, we understand that people can get conned into committing these crimes, mm-hmm. but once you know it, if you continue to pay tax after you know that it is a criminal offence to do so, you will still be criminally liable under the International Criminal Court Act and under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court internationally. Criminal liability for those crimes as a principal offender. So it's very important for everybody to understand that there is now, for the first time in history, legislation which makes it a duty to refuse to pay tax. And that's the crucial issue. We have to get that into position.
And this is quite exciting legislation in one sense. This is important legislation that really, if the public could be alerted to this legislation, they could use and turn this legislation against the government and benefit themselves too. So those that are morally outraged by this have the legislative backing to make a stance by the withholding or refusal to pay council tax until such time as the conditions that the illegality of the wars are actually redressed, and that in the process they could save themselves a fair fortune by withholding the tax or refusing the tax.
Yes.
In all aspects, as you mentioned, council tax, the local council tax, but also your VAT and your inland revenue.
Yes.
So all that could be withheld with a good legal, an excellent legal argument about the illegality of our wars that we are continuing to enact in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
So how do we get the public to embrace this then?
I think what you're doing now is exactly the right thing, which is to publicise it. We need to get the information out to people and them to understand that this law does exist. I would therefore recommend just go and look at the International Criminal Court Act, section 52, which is to do with conduct ancillary to the crime. And when you look at it in detail, you will understand what it means. It's the same old accessory to murder or whatever it is. You are an accessory to genocide and so on. So just understanding that is the first step. I think the important thing then is for a number of us to join in the sort of movement about, say, refusing to pay council tax. Now, I have approached my local council, informed them that they are committing a crime in collecting tax. because it's just as much a crime to collect the tax as it is to pay it.
And what was their response to?
Well, they've been a bit bemused by it, and they said, well, thank you for the information, full stop. However, we will be raising it at the council meeting. Again, we'll go on and on until they understand they are breaking the law. And I think the important bit is that when institutions like councils start to understand they have to do this on behalf of council taxpayers, ratepayers or whatever it's called, and businesses in the borough, then they can do it on our behalf, and they can get the legal arguments worked out and paid for, if you like, by the council, so that it's not just one or two individuals saying, look, this is a criminal offence. It's a council on behalf of all its ratepayers saying, look, we believe this is a criminal offence. We must, by law, stop handing over tax. We must stop collecting it until, as you say, the government is acting lawfully under the laws of law. So that's the second route. And a third route is the same applies to businesses. So a business and a company director, a bank director, for instance, who is handing over millions of pounds to the government, is committing a criminal offence and can be charged with conduct ancillary to genocide. So I'd like to take out a few test cases with some of our banks and BP and one or two other organisations who are supporting this government and the wars, and charge the directors of the company with a criminal offence. And we argue it in court. I want to see the whole issue brought out in court so we can look at what the law says, what has been happening, and whether or not that is a criminal offence.
And we are talking something horrendously evil at heart here, what we're doing in slaughtering innocent women, children, men in the Middle East that have done us no harm.
Yes.
And I think if you bring it down to an individual level, it's a soul-searching question for every single person who's, say, viewing this video, who actually disagrees with or policy in the Middle East.
Yes.
Now, at that individual level where they've got to make that decision, we're giving a clear message here, aren't we? We're saying it's incumbent on you to do this. We're not saying please do it. He says you are committing an offence if you don't do this. So this is a strong message. A little bit nervous about the prospect of entering and embarking on something that's going to bring them in confrontation with the state initially, and a natural fear of them being picked off. What would you say to them?
There's two things I would say. Is first of all, look back in history. All the big changes in society throughout the ages have come about as a result of tax resistance. Magna Carta is probably one of the best examples. Now that came about because the barons in 1215 refused King John's request for more money and troops and so on to fight in Aquitaine, and they said, no, we've had enough. We will not provide any of that until you sign our demands. You agree to our demands. And they put down 63 demands, and he agreed to them all in order to wage his war. And that's how Magna Carta came about. The same thing happened with American independence. America wouldn't be an independent nation state if they hadn't objected to being taxed without representation in Britain's Parliament. And the stamp tax and the tea tax, Boston Tea Party and all that came about, and independence came about for America because they rejected and refused to pay the taxes to Britain without representation. Same thing happened with Indian independence. Gandhi was a great guy. He said no violence, but we're not going to pay the salt tax. And he got a mass movement going and said, no. And that led to Indian independence. Throughout history, it is all the French Revolution again happened because of the imposition of far too heavy duties and taxes and other things by the government. So historically, it has been the single most effective move that people can take. Up till now, it has always been unlawful at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And people have had the guts to band together and say, no, we're not doing it. The great advantage now is that for the first time in history, you have a lawful duty to do it.
Yes, that's the key point.
And that's the point, because you can then say, no, I understand the law requires me to refuse to pay tax, and if you want me to pay it, you're going to have to take me before a judge, and we're going to argue this in court. And I say, that is the meaning of this law, and this criminal offence, when you get a conflict of laws, that the judge, courts have to decide between them. And we now have 4 precedents. The British government has made it very clear that it is a criminal offence. In the Ministry of Defence regulations, it's very clearly laid out. The British government made it clear. The Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal made it clear. When Germany's leaders tried to argue that they were just following orders and that they ran the war because Hitler had told them to, the judges said, no, that's not good enough. You have a duty to humankind, in a sense, in international law, to refuse to obey the orders of your government when those orders are illegal. Mm-hmm. And that's precisely what's happening now. We all know that the order to kill men, women and children in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Pakistan, wherever it's happening, and we are killing people, that's a criminal offence. Our government is using our money to commit that criminal offence, and we have a duty to not hand over the money because we know that's what it's being used for. Yeah. So I think there are lots of ways, but I do think if we can get lots of people doing this, and we can publicise it, and we can get councils acting on our behalf, and we can get businesses saying, no, we are going to refuse as well. If we get a big chains of pubs and others who say, right, no, from now on we do not charge VAT on beer or wine or everything else, and we're not going to hand it over because it is a criminal offence. Yeah. You'll soon get a mass movement through the country saying enough's enough, we're not going to go with this anymore.
And in terms of signposting, people that have actually already been brave enough to stick their head above the parapet,
yes.
I know I was inspired by my now colleague, a guy called Tony Rook, who in Sussex refused to pay his council tax. This was under Section 15 Article 3,
right.
But he also refused to pay his TV licence on the same grounds. Now, I mentioned Tony because he's made a film about the war and about this stance, which is Reasonable Cause, which shows the atrocities and the outcome of our aggressive foreign policy and our illicit entering into war in Afghanistan and Iraq, which you're talking about. And you've mentioned these wars, and you've mentioned how these have escalated now into Libya and into Pakistan and to some extent Syria. Now, what sort of volume of people have been affected, do you think, in terms of our policy?
It's just horrifying. The minimum deaths that have taken place since October the 7th, 2001, I put out about 220,000. The very minimum directly killed by the actions of American and British armed forces. So that's the Iraq body count has made has totaled up the number of Iraqis who were killed by a direct action. So direct action is killing perhaps 250,000 people. But that's not the real issue. It's the people who die afterwards because the water supplies have been poisoned, or their injuries cause them not to be able to live any longer, or the use of DU, depleted uranium, and radioactive materials. So in Iraq, for instance, cancers for children and others have gone up 700%. it's horrendous what's happened there because of our use of depleted uranium, which is supposed to have no effect but has a dramatic effect. Now, I reckon there are about 5 to 6 deaths for every death in action as a result of a bomb. There are 5 to 6 associated deaths. Mm-hmm. And in total, I believe that the figure is somewhere, some people will say it's upwards of 2 to 3 million people that died. There's an Australian university professor who has done a lot of work on this, Gideon Pollier. But say we take the sort of lowest figure and the highest figures, you're talking at least 1.5 million people, and at least 35% of those are children. So that's more than a third. So that's over 500,000 children have been killed in the last 10 years. Now, that I've gone back in history, and I cannot think, even when Herod was killing children in the time of Christ, the firstborn child and so on, the numbers are just utterly horrendous. We have never ever behaved like this before as a nation. So America and Britain, the atrocities of what are going on the last 10 years are the worst in our history. We've, instead of killing soldiers, we now target and kill civilians. 95% of the deaths that have taken place in the last 11 years are civilians, men, women and children. Now, what is that about?
We have a nation that's psyche is primarily focused on the war heroes. There's more sympathy for those troops that are committing these acts under order than there is for the innocent victims. That's the way I see it. And that's in every aspect of society, even within, for instance, institutions like the church.
Yeah.
They're more likely to be sympathetic to the soldiers who've come back with injuries than they are to the deaths of people in Iraq, Afghanistan and the Middle East. And that saddens me greatly in terms of how I don't underestimate the task we've got of changing the hearts and minds of the nation in terms of these are our brothers and sisters.
Yes.
Nothing less, nothing more, and that we should love them just the same as our neighbour next door, and that when we see these families totally and utterly destroyed,
yes,
by our policy, a policy that was instigated by Tony Blair in this way, I think, over the last decade, but continues and is showing no sign of abating by our current government. When we have that, we really do have to climb uphill, but change the hearts and minds, and somehow get the nation to have some moral courage on these issues.
I agree with you.
But there is something that they can do to benefit themselves in their own pocket by withholding these tax. But ultimately the decision comes down to the soul, and that you've got to be outraged, and if you're so outraged with this, you've got to be prepared to make that stance.
Yes.
I think it was Edmund Burke says the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing.
Perfect.
And at the moment the nation by and large is doing nothing, and what we're trying to give a message loud and clear here, that it's incumbent on each and every individual to make that stance and start withholding the taxes, because only in that way, if we can hurt the pockets of the government and create a critical mass, can we get this awful, atrocious foreign policy stopped in its tracks and redressed. What I want to finish, Chris, on take you back when you first started, and what was it that, at a personal level, that gave you the courage to mount this campaign against all odds and keep it going up to present, in spite of the obstructions and the blockages that you faced and the closing ranks in every corner?
Yeah, I sometimes wonder. I think basically it's just the horror of the fact, it goes back to what you were saying, we're making heroes of our soldiers. What is heroic about murdering children from 5 miles away or whatever it is, with missiles and so on? And here is a totally innocent person murdered, and it's that issue of we cannot, I've been brought up to believe that murder is wrong, that we've got to live with everybody, that, you know, we just have a duty and a conscience, and it's the feeling that, you know, nobody is doing anything, and we are just constantly being told by our leaders that it's the right thing to do, and I can't ever believe that it's the right thing to do. I just cannot. The thing that keeps me going is every now and again you get something outrageous happening. And I think, for instance, when 559 MPs were told by David Cameron that we were firing cruise missiles into Libya, 559 MPs voted in favour of it, and 14, I think it was, against. Now that's the biggest majority in recent history. So here are, you know, and I just despair.
That's right.
What are these people? Is there a human being amongst them? I just don't know.
And notwithstanding the very fact, I mean, all war is morally wrong, but to go to war on the basis of the lies that our country, our nation has been on, and we can look back at the weapons of mass destruction and the David Kelly
Yes.
saga, and the doubts, serious doubts about how he came to his death,
Yeah.
and the 45-minute threat. Now all of this and this bogus, this hoax threat that somehow those in the Middle East that are about to attack us and cause us grave danger, we are under threat from Islamic terrorism, all has been greatly exaggerated.
Yes.
In order to try and justify what we are doing. And that continues, and there doesn't seem to be any politicians actually searching for the truth.
None.
They're all willing and able to turn blind eyes to what is now quite obvious, the wrongs. So it's not just a case of it's morally wrong, we have gone to war on lies, and the lies are now plainly obvious.
Yes. I think the biggest lie of all is the lie that it's lawful.
Mm-hmm.
They have said over and over again the rationale for going to war with Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya is that it was authorised by the UN Security Council by resolution operating under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter.
Mm-hmm.
That is a lie, a straightforward lie. The United Nations can never authorise the use of armed force.
Mm-hmm.
Of course they never tell us that, and our government deliberately leaves those phrases out.
Yes.
There was a phrase in Article 41, the Security Council may decide what measures, not involving the use of armed force, are to be employed to give effect to its decisions. The British government leaves out the phrase not involving the use of armed force and tells us that it has been authorised. That is a dreadful lie, and it's that lie which takes us to war and makes all our lawyers in this country are going along with it. I can't believe it. But it's these sort of issues that we've got to somehow expose the lies that are underpinning every action of the British government in the last 10, 12 years, and it's horrendous.
And there are other sort of neutral countries, such as Malaysia, that have brought to the attention and have brought to trial in their own way the issue of Tony Blair and George Bush in the legality of wars. Have you anything to say on what other nations think on this?
I mean, I know only too well that there are so many people out there who know damn well that what we are doing and what America is doing is totally wrong. It's evil under the law. And thank God for those nations like Malaysia and others who are trying to take action on it. Mm-hmm. We just need more coordinated international action to use the laws that we've got and the International Criminal Court. And what I would really love to see is our leaders, the main ones, you know, Blair, Straw, Hoon, Goldsmith, Brown, Cameron, Clegg, Prescott and so on, standing in front of the International Criminal Court rather like the Germany's leaders were laid out in front of the court at Nuremberg. We need 20 of our leaders laid out in the International Criminal Court, answering to charges of genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes. And then I think we might have an effect worldwide.
Yes.
And so we've got to do it, and I think Malaysia was a good example. Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Tribunal was a great example of what can be done, and it's dangerous for Bush and Blair ever to go to Malaysia.
Yeah.
Thank God. We need to make sure that it happens in every European country. We're all signed up to the Rome Statute. We've all said that we will uphold and maintain it, and we now need to do it. And instead of just bringing African leaders to court,
Yes.
we need to bring our leaders to court. We won't be able to get Bush and Obama and the Americans because they've not signed up to it.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a way of ensuring that they can be brought to court in America, and that's very important. The Genocide Convention, which was signed in 1948, after 40 years, and Senator Proxmire in America spent 19 years in Congress trying to persuade the American Congress to sign up to and ratify the Genocide Convention. He finally succeeded just before he retired, after 19 years of trying. And in 1988, President Reagan signed the Genocide Convention Implementation Act in America, and that says that if any American citizen commits genocide, then they can be charged and tried in American courts.
Mm-hmm.
And they have. And Cheney and Bush and Blair and Wolfowitz and all the rest of them have committed crimes of genocide, and they must be held to account in court there. They can also be held to account for murder, as their Vincent Bugliosi has written in his excellent book called The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder. Mm-hmm. I recommend that to anybody if you want to find out what can happen. Mm-hmm. And so holding them to account in America and Tony Blair and others to account in The Hague, I think we can change the world.
And I'd second that. I remember it reminds me of my situation on the day I got dismissed from South Yorkshire Police for speaking truth to the bar. I said to the dismissing officer, the police on the 2nd of September 2010, the police service are about to nobble the wrong Tony, and South Yorkshire Police are indeed rendering themselves at risk of being complicit in the murder of innocent women and children in war-torn Afghanistan and Iraq. And I said that to the dismissing officer, and in the same way he said, well, your views could be correct and truthful, but it's not where we are today. But we've got to get the nation to a different position and a different conceptual model of how we should behave ethically in the world. Wars are illegal and it's morally wrong what we're doing, and what we're saying, the message is coming across loud and clear from you, is that we have an obligation to legally now to make that stance. As well as that, it can benefit by you keeping your taxes to yourself, away from the government who are actually perpetrating these illegal acts. Yeah. So I think on that note, I think
absolutely
I'd like to thank you very much for
giving
that insight. It's been a privilege to interview you. Thank you very much indeed.